Welcome to part 2 of our first class. Now let's shift away from color and on to what is termed perspective. It's a technique that was used in the classical period, however it was not recorded. It was then resurrected and perfected during the Renaissance. Perspective relates to how objects in a work portray their spatial differences as we would see them live. Most images we see, whether on TV or in photography, have the right perspective. Objects in the foreground, closer to us, look like they're closer to us. Objects further away look that way. This was not always the case. The man credited in the mid-1400s with perfecting the formula for drawing in perspective was a triple threat. His name was Filippo Brunelleschi. He was a finalist in the competition to cast the biblical scenes for the Gates of Paradise doors on the Florence Baptistry. Shortly after coming in second on the doors, he won the competition for the design of the Duomo, the roof, of the Florence Cathedral. Now, believe it or not, the building was designed to use a roof circumference larger than any builder knew how to construct. So the church had a competition. They seem to do a lot of that in Florence. And Brunelleschi won by designing a double-walled dome. Of course, he also had to invent the construction equipment to accomplish what he wanted to build. For more information on this, you can read a wonderful book called Brunelleschi's Dome by Ross King. But I digress. Brunelleschi refined the geometric means in a solution for keeping distant objects looking right. This Hubert-Robert scene uses several of those methods. Remember, we're dealing with something that's flat, two-dimensional. It's got length, it's got width, but it has no depth. Objects in the distant become proportionally smaller. In two-dimension, it also helps to raise the objects into the scene. Lastly, adding an atmospheric perspective refers to lightening the colors in the distance by adding a haziness, much the way we would be looking into the horizon as we lose our ability to focus. Got it? These artsy tools can be used to draw the viewer's eye deeper into a two-dimensional work. Single point perspective takes you decisively to a single vanishing point. Multi-point perspective provides a few viewing routes. If you happen to be a skier or a snowboarder, you know about the fall line. It's a good metaphor for how a single point perspective leads your eye. So you would think artists know how to paint. Once they know perspective, they would use it all the time. However, take a look at this Matisse. Shouldn't he know better than to paint like this? Do you get a sense of depth? Most people would say this is quite a flat painting, that the outside image looks as close to us as the table and the woman. So the question is, do you think Matisse knew better? Do you think he could draw in perspective, or do you think he chose to flatten the picture? We can talk a little bit more about that when we get together. Here's another aspect of perspective, quite an interesting one. I happen to think that Milan is underrated as an art city. This is from the Brera in Milan, and this is by Mantegna, Andrea Mantegna, and he uses a technique called foreshortening, where he's squeezing the body in to this particular space. And the question is, do you think he did this deliberately? Do you think he knew that he was giving us kind of an altered view? This is a particularly interesting painting because as you walk down the hallway, the painting is at eye level, a little below eye level actually, where it almost as if Christ is on a gurney. And so you're looking at it right at his feet and into the painting. And he accomplishes quite a lot by the way he does the foreshortening. And so I wonder what you think about it. Let's talk more about it. If you notice, he does have He has a mixture of things that are painful and things that are peaceful. His face is quite peaceful. Well, meanwhile, you can see signs of his torture with the spinmata on his hand and in his feet. So we'll talk more about that. Another painting that we'll get into is the Bart de Folies Bergère. So we'll quickly have a discussion using this as our illustration. And we're going to be talking about how do you describe art. And you can describe art formally, descriptively, and interpretively. So if I were formally going to describe this, that's what I like to call the Joe Friday, just the facts, ma'am. This is a picture of a woman, looks like she might be behind the counter. There's a crowd of people behind her and a man standing at the side. Just the facts, okay? Or you may get into a much more descriptive analysis or a more formal one. The more formal, to be particular, will lead us through the details. The woman is at the center. She's anchoring the scene. Her head and pendant and buttons create a strong vertical line. The white lace on her jacket or her blouse draw your attention to her face and her deadpan expression. The lights on the left and right help draw your attention to her. The right side is a little puzzling. It's kind of off balance. And we begin to wonder about what's going on behind her. Is that a second person, or is that her? Is it a mirror? And what about that man? Okay, if we were to move further into a more interpretive read, we would say, is she happy or sad? Is she staring directly at us? Which is a technique that Manet used quite often. He likes to have his models look straight into us. Where are we standing as we look at this piece? The reflection, if that is a reflection behind her, seems to be skewed. So how could we see her back but also see the man? So we can talk more about this when we get online, but it certainly is a provocative scene. And as you begin to layer into this, examples such as talking about feminism, well, what do we think? Is she a woman that is working behind the bar? Is she, Suzanne is her name, is she working behind the bar, but is she also selling herself after hours? Is that what the man is there for, or is he there buying a beverage? We simply don't know. The mirror plays a very important role. The mirror plays an important role. How do you think Manet came up with such an idea? Remember, Manet studied the Spanish masters. In an effort to connect the dots, we review our mental inventory of artworks we may have seen. It's kind of fun to look back and see, where do you think the artist got the idea? Well, Diego Velázquez was painter to the Spanish court in the 17th century, and he was one of the artists that Manet studied extensively. He predated Goya. Manet traveled to Spain in 1865 to study Velázquez, as well as Goya, Zurbarán, and the others. Some of his methods are traceable to his visits to the Prado in Madrid. Las Meninas is a puzzling work. Where are we standing? Why is the artist looking towards us? If one looks closely, we can see a reflection in the upper center of the painting where there's a small mirror, and you can see that we're standing next to the king and the queen. The artist, the child, the chamberlain are all looking at the royals who are standing next to us. The Flemish artist Van Eyck also used the mirror trick 200 years earlier. That would be in the 1400s. The wedding of Arnolfino, in this case, the artist and we, the viewer, are seen in that little mirror on the wall. Nearly 100 years after Manet painted the Bart de Folies Bergère, Canadian Jeff Wall created The Picture for Women. What is this photograph about? What is the action taking place? Here again, we see a woman behind a counter. Do we see the similarities to Manet? The techniques relate and may include some of the interpretive readings of the woman in each case, where she becomes the object and you're staring at the woman. That's Jeff Wall himself, and he's the equivalent of the Follies man staring at the woman from the side. The object of his desire, in this case it's his wife I'm told, has the same disconnected look as Suzanne the barmaid. And she's facing us, but the camera and Jeff are reflections. We have one last masterpiece and concept to view. When a painting is completed, can have an effect on the work's meaning. I chose this Goya scene as a departure from the French and Italian art, which is studied most often. Like the Velázquez, this is in the Prado in Madrid. It's one of the pieces that Manet, who I told you I talk a lot about, studied. What is the subject? It appears to be the unarmed civilians being lined up and executed. One man has his arms outstretched, but does not appear to be pleading. But he is communicating with us. On a formal level, the work is composed in two halves. The left side are the Spanish townspeople or peasants, and the more rounded figures, they're more rounded and personable than the upright, rigid, very linear riflemen on the right. The townspeople are highly expressive, while the soldiers are anonymous with their backs turned to us. The peasant who's next to be shot stands out due to his white blouse, cruciform positioning, and the illumination of the light. The work, which is called the 3rd of May, 1808, depicts an actual event. The French army who had invaded Spain was punishing the townspeople for their rebellion to protest French occupation, which occurred the day before. Knowing what you do at this point, what would the meaning be of the painting at that time? Well, it's a little bit of a trick question, because the painting was done 6 years later and commissioned by the King of Spain after the Spanish had drove the French out. How might we have read the work if it was painted right away while the occupation was occurring? At that time, it would be more like a war correspondent piece chronicling the action. Instead of being painted later, it represented the bravery and sacrifice of the proud Madrid rebels. The timing changed the meaning.